All right, in part one, I talked a little bit about California's coastal gill nets. There is a part two to this story. It is human outrage. It is public outrage. It is a final stand to say that we are not going to tolerate this, that causes change. The best thing that ever happened for white sharks in the United States was human outrage for whales dying in gill nets because we're moved by mammals. We're saddened by mammals. That helped juvenile white sharks. It wasn't science pointing out that, hey, you've got to let these white sharks, because they are at the top of the food chain and they don't produce very quickly, you've got to let them mature, you've got to let them grow, you can't be wiping them out like this. No, it was human outrage at the suffering of marine mammals that led to the Marine Mammal Protection Act that, incidentally, also helped out sharks. Just give me one study. Give me one study that's results led to further conservation of white sharks and restrictions on behavior towards white sharks. Speaking of gill nets, I've got to talk about one more political move that happened. I'm sure a lot of people don't want me to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about politics, but you force me to talk about politics when you take the fairy tale approach of thinking that science is going to solve our problems when politics steps in and just smashes that to bits. Now, I mentioned the removal of coastal gill nets, which were intended to help cetaceans and other marine mammals, but actually ended up helping white sharks and I'm sure many other coastal animals that develop along the coast as well. But there's also the federal water gill nets off the coast. These are actually designed to catch thresher sharks and swordfish, animals like that should not be getting fished at all. But not only are they being fished, but they are legally fished, and they are fished using something horrific called a gill net. Now, California tried to phase this out. The Trump administration moved in and vetoed that movement. As you can imagine, these giant gill nets don't just catch thresher sharks and swordfish, they catch whales, they catch dolphins, they catch all kinds of animals out there. They're just bad across the board, but they're justified because supposedly the United States would import more seafood instead of producing its own seafood. Again, it is about economic competitiveness instead of the greater good of the planet. Look, it doesn't matter who's in the office, it doesn't matter if they're Democratic or Republican, they can still do these terrible things. And if you are going to get on board with that because of America and international competitiveness and economics, well, then you're kind of saying that being patriotic means that you have to hate the ocean, because this is not sustainable. This is not only is it not sustainable, it's not ethical. It's horrid. Science has already proven why this is bad, but it just doesn't matter when the powers that be decide that they are going to do a quick rush at making money now rather than look at the long term. Speaking of disconnection, there's quite the element of speciesism involved as well, in that we are objectifying these animals and deciding that treating them in such a manner is just fine because we as humans have decided that it is fine and necessary. But do not forget the reality that you are hooking animals. You are allowing animals to labor hanging from a hook on a long line until the scientist comes along to check on that animal, or you're directly fishing for them in order to hook them, pull them on board the boat, or pull them alongside the boat, and then attach mechanisms to them, or surgically implant things inside of them and then release them and say, oh, it will be fine. While simultaneously, some of those same people will give a presentation on how delicate the balance of survival is in nature and how easily that can be disrupted. These scales of survival changed by one incident that an animal encounters, and that incident, how many times, is from a scientist that is supposed to be saving that animal. That is speciesism. It's quite appalling to me to hear these people that mutilate these sharks change their perfection to carrying around big, ugly, disgusting objects on their fins or hanging off of their sides or inside their bellies, or even killing these sharks in order to collect the data to complete their papers, simultaneously talking about how people touching sharks are disrespecting the animals. The argument of whether or not touching an animal is disrespectful doesn't change the fact that there's a huge disconnect when you kill an animal, but don't consider that to be disrespectful. There's a bit of an egocentric element to this as well, isn't there? Because think back to when you first heard someone on TV or social media talk about the importance of obtaining knowledge in order to save these animals. And you got kind of excited and you're like, oh yeah, we got to do that. But in your mind, the timeline began on that day. The timeline of the race to get enough knowledge to save those animals started in your mind the day that you learned about the race to get that knowledge. The problem is that feeling was true for the generation before you, the generation before them, the generation before them. This has been going on for as long as research has been going on. And I was part of it. I was guilty. You know what? All I wanted to do was help white sharks. So when I went out on my first internship in South Africa and tagging was going to be involved and this and that and the other thing, I would have done anything that I was told to do because I was excited to help the animal. But even back then, some people there were saying, good Lord, how long are we going to tag these animals? How much more information can we learn? And I was the silly, excited, naive one saying, no, we got to do this. We got to learn about these animals. What percent of people who started out with good intentions just become part of the system? They are somewhere in a lab or they are somewhere working part of someone else's thesis statement, which is really just to get the next grant and continue their research, but hasn't really gone anywhere in terms of actually effectively saving the species. It's always good to have data to back up the mission of activists. But what data do you think we're actually missing that isn't convincing enough to say that, hey, this has got to stop? As if the death toll wasn't high enough from the fishing industry, we actually have scientists setting their own long lines so that they can go and get their own numbers about what the population status is of sharks in that area. And they are killing those sharks and counting how many of the species are on their long lines. You can't tell me that that isn't screwed up. And I know you're prepared with your well-trained comeback. You just don't understand how the science works. Some of these evils are necessary in order to accomplish the greater good. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Wrong. We're using the wrong ingredients and we don't know how to cook. You know, there's also a little bit of disrespect, a little shade thrown to the scientists of old with this attitude that today, now that we have technology, now is when the research is actually taking place. Scientists have been out there doing what they're doing for a very long time, and they learned incredible information, not using satellite tags or any other types of highly technical tools. Observation science is extremely powerful. In many ways, I feel like we've abandoned observation and critical thinking in exchange for data being plotted on graphs that is reported back to us through computers. I know what some of you are going to say, that marine reserves were set up with the support of scientific data, but you're trying to win with a technicality. Let me explain in two parts. One, it was supporting data. The data itself was not the fundamental movement to set up the reserve. Two, what data exactly? You're kind of implying that it was the data from these highly invasive tagging techniques that established this marine reserve. That simply isn't true. When nearly the entire population of a species of sharks disappears from an area, that data is not from tagging. That is from fish catches. That is what scientists used to do in the old days in order to establish population counts. They're using fishing data. You do not have to go out and tag more animals in order to find out that animals are disappearing from the earth. You know, I was in South Africa back in 2014 pursuing the Osage story after Osage came through and did whatever they wanted to do despite local protests and protests of scientists. But the handful of scientists that were involved and benefited monetarily were the ones that the world heard from. Now, I was friends with someone who was part of one of those companies, a scientist at one of those companies, and she told me in confidence that she didn't have any choice. She had to go along with it because the company teamed up with OSearch. And I kept pressing and saying, well, what exactly is going to come of this data? You know, what's the bright side of it? And she got tired of the questioning and said, well, you're not a scientist. You'll just have to wait and see in 10 years what the data provides. So 2014, it's 2021 now, which means there are 3 years before all the data that was collected back in 2014. It was actually 2013. I was there in 2014. OSearch that was there in 2013 or something like that. So some miracle data is supposed to be derived from these tags, right? Which was the justification for going in and slam bam ripping all these sharks out of the ocean and mutilating their dorsal fins and killing a few along the way, despite the fact that they are protected. Incidentally, that's exactly what they're supposed to be protected from: exploitive fishing. But what has happened in South Africa? White sharks have completely disappeared in some areas and have diminished in other areas. But I'm sure the data is going to come through in the next 2 years and save those sharks.
And please, don't make me waste my time addressing this ridiculous notion that a couple of orcas misbehaving occasionally are responsible for white sharks, who have been established on that coast for as long as humans can remember, completely disappearing. We can do another episode on that if you really want me to. In the meantime, you could go learn about how longlining and offshore fishing has only increased despite the data showing that our sharks in South Africa are threatened. You can go watch my interview with Chris Fallows talking about how there has been a steady decline of pelagic sharks there thanks to the increase in fishing pressure. Maybe those scientists busy tagging the same white sharks over and over and over again could have been out there sabotaging those fishing vessels if they want to save them. No, wait. I would never say go do something violent. I will just, kind of vaguely reference it and then say, you're very special people. I love you all.
Okay, so this is overwhelming. It's a little bit upsetting. And you're probably ready to lash out at me and say, well, if all this is true, then what do you suggest? What is your solution? I'll tell you what my solution is. My solution is for you to stop playing the game, because you can't pursue an actual solution as long as you are a willing participant in a fake solution. Just because I can't single-handedly provide the solution to the corruption and greed of humans does not mean that I'm wrong. It doesn't mean that I made up anything that I said today. I'm not saying that science is a problem, and I'm certainly not saying that knowledge is a problem. But pretending that we are existing with a lack of knowledge right now and pretending that that's the problem and that we need to go and solve that problem, that game is the problem. And unfortunately, science is a career, which means once you are a well-established scientist, how willing are you to just say, well, this is a broken system, I'm part of an issue, and I should walk away from it? Are you really going to do that? Especially if you've reached professor status at a school that brings in a lot of extra income as part of a tagging program in which people come in and pay to go out and tag sharks because in their naive little minds they think that they're helping, while the program makes more money from being part of this fake solution. One thing we can agree on, it's made for great TV opportunities. It has turned Shark Week into one big fishing show. Humans versus sharks. Let's pull them out of the ocean. Let's show them who's boss, and then let's mutilate them and say that we're doing them a favor. And if anyone challenges this idea, just say, well, you don't understand because we need knowledge to save these sharks. Keep saying that. We're almost out of sharks. You say it long enough, we will be out of sharks.